Less than 6 hours after our wedding, my husband came home from another woman's hotel room and found his suitcases waiting by the door. My attorney was sitting in the living room, so was the chairman of his company. A private security supervisor stood near the entrance. On the coffee table were 3 documents. The first was a board notice suspending him from his position. The second was an emergency request to freeze any changes to our marital property. The third was a shipyard mortgage authorization he believed I would never see. Julian Price stood in the doorway wearing the same tuxedo from the night before. His shirt was badly wrinkled. His pants were stained with seawater and black grease from the marina. There was a faint lipstick mark near his collar. The air around him smelled like whiskey, hotel soap, and the gardenia perfume Camille Ross always wore. It was not my perfume. Julian stared at the room for several seconds. Then he looked at me. I was sitting beside the floor-to-ceiling windows in a navy suit, with both hands resting over my stomach. He did not know I was 10 weeks pregnant. I had planned to tell him at the wedding. Now the baby was the one thing I was determined not to let him use. "Nora, what is this?" His voice was quiet, as though he still had not fully understood what he had walked into. My attorney, Serena, slid the documents closer to him. "Mr. Price, as of now, you are not permitted to enter this residence or contact Ms. Whitmore directly. All communication must go through counsel." Julian did not even look at her. His eyes stayed on me. "You had me followed?" "No." I looked at his wet shoes. "The marina, the airport, and the hotel parking lot are public places. We only documented the choices you made after leaving our wedding." His expression changed. "I only took Camille to a hotel. You left our wedding. You drove to a private marina. You spent 3 hours alone with her on a boat. Then the two of you entered a hotel together?" I paused. "You came back because she told you the Pier 47 ownership records weren't in my office, didn't you?" Julian glanced toward the hallway leading to the study. It was a tiny movement, but it answered the question. A truly innocent man would have looked confused. Julian's first instinct was to check whether the documents were still where he expected them to be. I picked up a contract from the table. "Are you looking for this?" It was a spousal authorization for a mortgage against the shipyard. According to the draft, after our marriage I would agree to treat Pier 47 as marital property. Then Julian would use the shipyard as additional collateral for a $12 million bridge loan. His breathing stopped for a second. That was only a backup financing plan. "A plan that used my property without my knowledge, Nora. I can explain." "I'm sure you can." I nodded. "You can also explain why you and Camille had 2 one-way tickets to Lisbon for 17 days after the loan was supposed to close." The color disappeared from his face. This time, he did not deny it. He only stared at me, trying to calculate how much I knew. I knew enough. I knew he planned to have his name added to the shipyard paperwork after the wedding. I knew he planned to borrow against it. I knew he had promised Camille he would leave me once the money cleared. And I knew that more than $680,000 had moved through a vendor Camille recommended and into accounts connected to him. This was no longer just an affair. He had turned our marriage into a financing strategy. And his biggest mistake was believing I was only a museum archivist with no money, no influence, and no idea how business worked. He did not know Pier 47 was not an old shipyard a relative had allowed me to use. It belonged to Whitmore Harbor Trust. He did not know I controlled that trust, and he definitely did not know Whitmore Harbor Trust held 22% of the voting shares in Blue Current Ferries, the company where he worked. In other words, he had tried to use our marriage to take my shipyard. He had no idea that his position, his projects, and much of the future he was so proud of were already tied to my vote. Julian finally noticed the suspension notice. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. "You had me suspended?" "No." I kept my voice calm. An outside audit found inflated contracts, unusual transfers, and kickback payments connected to accounts you controlled. The board acted on the evidence. "You do not get to blame me for that." His head snapped up. "So you lied to me from the beginning. You let me believe you were an ordinary employee. You could have helped me with one phone call, and instead you stood there watching me struggle." I let him finish. Then I placed the petition to dissolve our marriage in front of him. "Last night, you made your final choice. Now I'm making mine." 48 hours earlier, I was still telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe the emails were only rough business planning. Maybe Camille was deliberately making their conversations sound personal. Maybe Julian was going to confess before the ceremony. I gave him too many maybes. because admitting I was about to marry a con man hurt more than continuing to believe him. My name is Nora Whitmore. I'm 33 years old. Most people who knew me believed my name was Nora Wells. I worked as an archive conservator at the Boston Maritime Museum. My job was to preserve old ship logs, restore maps, and organize recorded interviews from sailors and dock workers. The salary was modest. My clothes were simple. I drove an 8-year-old car. Most days, lunch was a cold sandwich eaten at my desk. When Julian met me, he believed that was my entire life. He did not know Wells was my grandmother's maiden name. He did not know Whitmore Harbor Trust controlled 3 waterfront terminals in East Boston, 2 marine repair facilities, and 22% of the voting shares in Blue Current ferries. Blue Current was Julian's company. It was also the company he constantly described as proof that he had built his success with no help from anyone. I rarely attended public events. Trust meetings were usually handled through representatives. In investment documents, I used the name N. Whitmore. There were almost no clear photographs of me online. I had not hidden my identity because I wanted to play some rich girl game. 5 years earlier, I had almost married another man. His name was Graham Cole. At first, Graham was thoughtful. He remembered how I liked my coffee. He brought dinner when I worked late. He told everyone he loved me, not my family name. Then he learned that I was about to receive voting control over the trust. Within 3 months, he was asking to attend investment meetings. He wanted to replace my financial advisors. He said married people should not allow outsiders to control family money. Eventually, he even tried to convince a doctor that my insomnia and anxiety meant I should not make major financial decisions alone. When I ended the engagement, he looked at me and said, "Without the Whitmore name, who do you think would want to marry you?" That sentence stayed with me for years. I promised myself that the next man would meet me before he met the Whitmore name. I thought hiding my wealth would protect me. Later, I learned that secrecy can hide an opportunity. It cannot change a person's character. I met Julian in the basement conservation room of the Maritime Museum. A heavy rainstorm had caused the old building to leak. We were rushing to save a collection of 19th century navigation maps. Julian was an operations manager at Blue Current at the time. His team had been upstairs giving a presentation about electric ferries. When he heard the basement was flooding, he took off his suit jacket, rolled up his pants, and started carrying boxes with the museum staff. He did not stand nearby giving orders. He did not wait for reporters to take pictures. He spent almost 2 hours in dirty water. By the time the last map was safe, his white shirt was completely soaked. I handed him a towel. He looked down at himself and said, "This may be the most expensive swimming lesson I've ever taken." I laughed. That was the first time we spoke. After that, he kept finding reasons to return to the museum. The first time he said he wanted to see the restored maps. The second time he claimed he needed to check whether the equipment his company had donated was working. The third time, he finally admitted he only wanted to ask me to dinner. Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant where the tables were so close we could hear every word from the couple next to us. Julian told me his father had worked as a dock mechanic. His mother worked in a hospital laundry. He said he grew up understanding that some of the most important work in a city was done by people whose names nobody remembered. He wanted to build cleaner, more affordable commuter ferries, not only for tourists, for ordinary people who lived near the harbor and needed reliable transportation. I liked that vision. I liked the way his face changed when he talked about it. Later, he brought soup when I worked late. When the museum lost power, he waited with me in the dark conservation room until the backup generator came on. When I had a migraine, he did not force me to go to the hospital or tell me I was being dramatic. He only asked, "Do you want me to stay, or do you need quiet?" That question mattered to me. He did not decide for me. He asked what I needed. We started dating 7 months after we met. A year later, we moved in together. Julian did not know the Harborview penthouse belonged to Whitmore Harbor Trust. I told him a deceased relative had left it for me to use. That was not entirely false. The property was held by a trust my grandfather had created. I simply did not tell Julian that I controlled the trust. At first, he never asked how much the apartment was worth. He paid half the household expenses. Whenever we bought furniture, he asked my opinion. After he received a promotion, he insisted on contributing more. I believed I had finally found a man who would not change because of money, and I did help him. Just not in the way he later accused me of helping. I never ordered Bluecurrant to promote him. I never bought him a title. I never asked the board to ignore his weaknesses. When the trust's investment team began looking for a leader for a new commuter ferry project, I only asked them to review Julian's proposal fairly. His proposal was good. He had worked hard on it. He deserved to be considered. The project succeeded, and he became Bluecurrant's youngest vice president of operations. A business magazine called him a working-class shipping star. He brought the article home and said, "I guess I finally proved a person can get somewhere without family connections." I looked at him and said nothing. He did not know I had been the person in the board meeting who insisted his lack of seniority should not automatically disqualify him. I did not replace his effort. I only made sure his work had a chance to be seen. At first, Julian still thanked me. Then he began to change. The change was slow enough that I could explain away every part of it. In front of friends, he would laugh and say, "Nora's job is cute. She spends her days repairing paper older than our grandparents." Then he would put an arm around me as if it were only a joke. He started telling people I did not understand real business pressure. If I questioned the risk of one of his projects, he would say, "You work with old maps." I manage projects worth tens of millions of dollars. He began suggesting I should leave the museum after we married. He said his income was more than enough. He said a wife who spent most of her time in a basement restoration room did not fit the public life he was building. Once I told him clearly that I would not quit my job. He smiled. "Why are you so defensive? After we're married, my money will be yours. Yours should be mine too." "That's what normal couples do," I asked. "Do normal couples have to close their personal accounts?" His smile paused for 1 second. "Only people who don't trust their partners need to keep everything separate." I thought about Graham. Then I quickly told myself Julian came from a traditional family. Maybe his idea of marriage and financial security was simply different from mine. Love required patience. That was what I told myself. I did not realize I had started explaining away the same warning signs all over again. Camille Ross returned after Julian and I became engaged. She had been his girlfriend in college. They entered business competitions together. They once planned to start a maritime company together. Later, Camille moved to London and began working in financial consulting. Julian told me their relationship had ended years ago. He said only professional respect remained. Camille returned to Boston during a difficult period for Bluecurrant. A battery supplier had delayed a major delivery. 2 new ferries could not be launched on schedule. Investors were nervous. Camille said she could help the company secure short-term financing. Julian personally recommended her as an outside advisor. The first time I met her was at a Bluecurrant charity dinner. She wore a silver gray gown and held my hand for a moment longer than necessary. "So you're Nora," she said. "Julian says you make his life feel very stable." It sounded like a compliment, but when she said stable, she made me sound less like a partner and more like a storage room. That night, she and Julian talked about college for hours. They knew every old joke. She knew what he wanted to drink without asking. Before his speech, she touched his wrist once, and he immediately relaxed. Sitting beside them, I had a sudden, uncomfortable thought. Maybe I was not the woman at the center of Julian's story. Maybe I was only the safe home he had arranged for himself after the exciting part was over. Camille began appearing more often. She called Julian at 10 at night to discuss financing. She sent messages on weekends claiming investors needed new numbers immediately. Halfway through our engagement photo session, she called again. Julian stepped away for 20 minutes. The photographer asked whether I wanted a break. I stood beside the water in a sample wedding dress while the wind pressed the fabric against my legs. Julian had his back to me. He was laughing. It was the easy laugh I had not heard at home in months. Once I asked him directly, "Is there really nothing between you and Camille except work?" He did not answer the question. Instead, he looked hurt. "I thought you were different from other women. You know how hard this industry is. You know Camille is good at what she does. Why do you have to treat every capable woman as a threat?" By the end of the conversation, I was the one apologizing. 6 weeks before the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. I stood in the museum bathroom holding the test for a long time. My first feeling was fear. Underneath it was a quiet kind of happiness. I sat in my car outside the clinic with the report in my hands and imagined Julian's face when I told him. I decided to tell him at our public wedding celebration. I also decided to reveal my real identity. I did not want to begin the next stage of my life with another secret. After the wedding, I planned to take Julian to meet the trust committee. I would explain the apartment, the shipyard, and the family investments. I would tell him I had quietly helped his project receive a fair review, and I would tell him we were having a child. I even bought a small white box. Inside was a pair of tiny baby socks. That night, Julian used the printer in my study to print the wedding seating chart. The machine kept producing pages. He received a phone call and left in a hurry. He forgot to collect the final documents. I only intended to gather the papers. Then I saw my name. The title read, Draft Spousal Collateral Authorization. The document stated that Nora Wells agreed to classify Pier 47 as marital property and allow Blue Current to use the shipyard as supplemental collateral for a $12 million loan. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake. Julian knew I had never agreed to use the shipyard to support his company. I kept reading. The final page included a forwarded email. Julian had sent it to Camille. He wrote, "She'll sign after the wedding. She doesn't understand financing, and she hates legal paperwork. If I tell her it's a normal marital document, she won't ask too many questions." Camille replied, "And after the money clears," Julian wrote. "We leave Boston 17 days later. I already booked Lisbon." My fingers went cold. Then the printer produced one more page. It was an itinerary. 2 one-way tickets to Lisbon. The departure date was 17 days after the wedding. The passengers were Julian Price and Camille Ross. I did not scream. I did not call Julian. I did not open his computer and search for more. I photographed what had appeared on my printer. Then I called Serena. She had represented the Whitmore family for years. After reviewing the documents, she asked only one question. "Have you signed anything authorizing the shipyard as collateral?" "No." "Do not confront him." "Why?" "Because this may be more than an affair." She was right. The trust's audit team began examining the bridge loan plan. They discovered that Julian and Camille had already submitted financing proposals to 3 lenders. Each proposal included the same condition. After the marriage, Julian expected to obtain spousal authorization over Pier 47. Then the audit found something worse. A battery supplier recommended by Camille had charged Blue Current almost 40% above market rates for 10 months. $680,000 had been transferred to a consulting company registered in Delaware. The company had no real office, no full-time employees. The listed contact was Camille's cousin. Bank records showed that some of the money eventually reached an account Julian controlled. He had already started taking money from the company. At the same time, he was planning to use our marriage to move the risk onto my shipyard. I sat in Serena's office holding the pregnancy report in one hand and the audit summary in the other. What do I do about the wedding? Cancel it. Legally, it was more complicated than that. Julian and I had already completed a small civil ceremony at City Hall. The public wedding was meant to be the celebration for family, friends, and investors. We had been legally married for 5 days. Serena could immediately request a freeze on any property changes and begin the process of dissolving the marriage. But the audit team needed time to secure the records before Julian could delete anything. Blue Current's board also needed the key findings confirmed before suspending him. I agreed to continue with the public ceremony, not only because of the investigation, because some part of me still wanted to give Julian one final chance. I know that sounds foolish, but I needed to believe that the man I had loved for 3 years had not been false from beginning to end. I told myself that if he confessed before the wedding, if he said Camille's name, if he admitted the loan plan, if he accepted responsibility, then maybe I would not remain married to him, but at least I could believe part of our past had been real. He did not confess. The night before the wedding, Julian sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork. "These are standard post-marriage financial forms," he said. "Once we sign them, we can organize the accounts, credit, and assets together." I turned to the page about Pier 47. "Why is the shipyard included?" He had not expected me to ask so directly. "It's just additional proof of assets. You told me it was an old property, a relative allowed you to use. It isn't being used efficiently. If we connect it to Blue Current, it could become much more valuable." When did I agree to that? Julian smiled, walked around the table, and kissed my forehead. "Nora, tomorrow will be a family. Married people don't question every little thing by asking who owns what." I looked at him. "Is Camille part of the family too?" His hand stopped on my shoulder. "Why are you bringing her up? Is she coming tomorrow?" "She's still in London," he answered too quickly. Camille had already booked a flight to Boston for the next day. Julian knew. His final message to her said, "No matter what happens at the wedding, I'll pick you up. Bring your passport." I asked him, "Is there anything else you need to tell me?" He looked directly at me. No. That was the moment the final piece of hope inside me went quiet. Our public wedding was held on a restored vintage ferry docked in Boston Harbor. The boat remained at the pier. White flowers covered the deck. Hundreds of warm lights hung beneath the glass canopy. Julian had invited company executives, investors, reporters, college friends, and every person he wanted to impress. He believed the wedding would transform him from a successful executive into a man with waterfront property, private capital, and real family power. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I stood alone in the bridal suite. I looked at Camille's flight information one last time. She would land at 8:10 that evening. Julian's final message to her read, "I'll find a reason to leave after the ceremony." "Bring the passports." I set down the phone. Then I removed my wedding dress. I changed into a simple white suit, no veil, no bouquet. I pinned my grandmother's sapphire brooch to my jacket. The brooch was worn by the chair of Whitmore Harbor Trust at formal meetings. Outside, the music began. The host announced the bride. No one appeared at the end of the aisle. The guests turned around. Julian stood beneath the floral arch with a smile that grew tighter every second. The host made the announcement again. I still did not appear. Julian called me 4 times. I did not answer. When the music started a third time, a door beside the ferry's wheelhouse opened. I came down from the upper deck. Serena walked on my right. 2 Whitmore trustees followed us. The chairman of Blue Current was with them. The first person to stand was not my father. It was not Julian's mother. It was Blue Current's chief financial officer. The moment she saw the sapphire brooch, she rose from her chair. "Miss Whitmore." The name moved across the deck in whispers. Julian stared at me. Confusion came first, then shock, then fear. "Nora?" He was still holding the microphone. "Why are they calling you Whitmore?" I stopped in the center of the aisle, because Wells was my grandmother's name. I control Whitmore Harbor Trust. Pier 47 belongs to the trust. And the trust holds 22% of Blue Current's voting shares. The deck became so quiet that all I could hear was the water against the hull. Julian's mother was sitting in the front row. A few hours earlier, she had told relatives Julian was generous for marrying a museum employee with no important connections. Now her mouth was open and she could not speak. Julian stepped down from the ceremony platform. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I planned to tell you today." And there was something else. I placed a hand over my stomach. "I'm pregnant." A wave of whispers passed through the guests. Julian's eyes widened. For 1 second, I saw real surprise and real happiness. Then his expression changed. He looked at the brooch. The trustees. The shipyard across the water. He was not thinking about becoming a father. He was calculating how much he had almost gained. "We need to speak privately," he said. "This should not happen in front of everyone. You did not need privacy when you sent my shipyard records to a lender. You did not need privacy when you promised Camille you would leave me after the loan closed." His face went white. "You read my private messages?" "No," Serena said. "Mr. Price, the relevant emails came from company servers and financing records. All materials were obtained through an independent audit and reviewed by counsel. A large screen at the end of the deck came on. There were no private photographs, no hotel videos, no unnecessary personal details. Only documents. The first was Julian's email to the lender. It stated that he expected to obtain spousal authorization over Pier 47 and use the property as collateral. The second was a limited set of emails between Julian and Camille discussing the Lisbon tickets, the loan closing, and the planned end of the marriage. The third was the independent audit summary showing inflated vendor prices, kickback accounts, and transfers linked to Julian. He stared at the screen as though he were watching someone else's life. That isn't the full story. Camille is emotionally unstable. I was trying to calm her down. The loan was only a backup plan. And the vendor payments have nothing to do with me. The chairman of Blue Current stepped forward. "Ms. Whitmore did not conduct the investigation. The board hired an outside audit firm. Your approval records, login history, and signatures are in the report. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties. Your company access and financial authority have been disabled. The relevant findings will be referred to the proper authorities. Julian took a step backward. For the first time, he understood that I had not used my wealth to create consequences for him. His emails had done that. His accounts had done that. His signatures had done that. He looked at me. We're already married. You can't destroy our marriage over a few messages. 5 days of marriage do not turn fraud into commitment. My attorney has already requested a freeze on property changes and started the process of dissolving the marriage. The shipyard was never marital property. Your name was never added to the title. I did not sign the loan authorization, and no investment was transferred to your company. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He had believed that after the wedding, he would receive a valuable apartment, a shipyard, an investment, and enough money to leave with Camille. Now he realized he had received nothing, and he was about to lose the job he had built his identity around. His eyes dropped to my stomach. What about the baby? The baby is mine. That's my child. Biologically, yes. I will not lie about that. But fatherhood is not a title you use only when you need leverage. Custody, visitation, and financial responsibility will be handled through the legal process. You will not use our child to enter my home, my company, or my property. Julian's mother suddenly stood. You knew all of this and still let us come here? Her voice was sharp. You planned to humiliate our family. A woman who would not even tell her husband her real name was never good enough for my son. Everyone looked at her. I waited a few seconds before answering. Then you should be relieved. After today, I will never be part of your family. Marina security approached and escorted her from the deck. Julian did not defend her. He only watched me. Nora, I can end things with Camille. I can return the money. We had 3 years together. You can't throw all of that away. He reached for my wrist. I looked down at his hand. He released me. I did not throw away 3 years. You treated my trust like an asset you could borrow against? Then I walked off the ferry. Rain had started falling over the harbor. My hands shook the entire time I sat in the car. People imagine that publicly exposing a man who betrayed you must feel powerful. I did not feel powerful. I felt exhausted and deeply sad. The evidence on the screen was real. But so were the nights Julian brought me soup. The hours he waited beside me at the museum, the moment he asked whether I wanted company or quiet. The hardest person to leave is not always someone who was terrible from the beginning. Sometimes it is someone who was once good to you and later decided that your love made you easy to use. After the wedding, Julian had several choices. He could remain at the marina and contact an attorney. He could cooperate with the audit. He could go home and wait to see whether I was willing to speak with him. At 7:42 that evening, Camille called. She had landed in Boston. Are you still coming to get me? Julian told her the wedding was over. He had been suspended. The loan was dead. Camille was silent for several seconds. Then she said, Then you need me more than ever. Julian drove to the airport. The rain was so heavy he could barely see the road. He went anyway. Camille ran from the international arrivals doors and hugged him. Security footage later showed that her first question was not, Are you all right? It was not. What happened? She asked. Can we still get the shipyard money? They argued in the car. Camille blamed Julian for failing to control me. Julian blamed Camille for returning on the wedding day and forcing the issue. Neither of them wanted to admit that the relationship they called love had been built around what they expected to gain. They checked into a hotel near the airport. Not because love had survived everything, because neither wanted to face the disaster alone. At 4:36 the next morning, Julian received an email from Serena. It instructed him to collect any personal property he had not yet moved into the penthouse after 9 a.m. and only with counsel present. It also ordered him to stop contacting me directly. He did not wait until 9. He left the hotel immediately and returned to the apartment. That was why he stood in my living room at 4:47 in the morning with Camille's lipstick on his collar and the smell of her hotel on his clothes, still trying to tell me he had only driven her there. You don't need to explain anymore, I said. His shame turned into anger. You were testing me from the beginning. You let me believe you had nothing. You could have helped me with one phone call. You watched me beg for financing. You watched me deal with investors, and all that time you were sitting behind the scenes controlling everything. I let him finish. Then I nodded. You are right about one thing. I hid my identity. I was afraid of being used again, so I convinced myself secrecy would protect me. That was not a healthy foundation for a marriage. I will take responsibility for that. Hope appeared in Julian's eyes. Then we both made mistakes. We can start over. They were not the same mistake. His face went still. I hid my name and my wealth. I did not steal from your company. I did not plan to mortgage your home. I did not promise another man I would take your money and leave you. And I did not leave our wedding to spend the night in a hotel with someone else. I leaned forward slightly. You did not lose me because I was rich. You lost me because you believed my love made me easy to exploit. His eyes filled with tears. The baby needs a father. The baby needs safety, honesty, and stability. If a court later decides you can participate safely in the child's life, I will follow that order. But you will not use the child to reach me, and you will not use the child to reach my property. He looked at my stomach for a moment. The anger left his face. I really did love you. I believed that he believed it. Maybe he had loved me once. Maybe ambition, entitlement, and greed had simply become more important. Maybe you did, I said. That's why this hurts. That answer affected him more than anger would have. He picked up his suitcases. At the door, he turned around as if he expected me to stop him. I lowered my eyes to the legal documents. I said nothing. When the door closed, all the strength left my shoulders. I covered my stomach with both hands and cried. No one told me I was strong. No one congratulated me for winning. Serena simply sat beside me until I could breathe again. What if I had told him the truth sooner? I asked. Maybe none of this would have happened. The timing might have changed, she said. His choices would still have belonged to him. It took me a long time to understand that. Leaving Julian did not make life easy. I still had to go through pregnancy, a public marriage collapse, a company investigation, questions from the media about why I had hidden my identity, and one truth that was harder to admit than everything else. I had noticed warning signs long before I found the documents. I ignored them because I wanted the relationship to be real. 2 months later, the outside audit was completed. Julian was charged in connection with commercial kickbacks, fraudulent reimbursements, and unauthorized financial arrangements. The case was not created by my family. It was built from bank records, vendor testimony, signed approvals, and an independent forensic audit. Camille did not face the same charges, but her emails about the Shipyard financing became evidence in the marriage case. Once she understood Julian would never gain access to the Shipyard or the trust's money, she left Boston. The relationship they claimed was worth destroying a marriage for did not survive 1 month without financial gain. Julian's attorney offered to settle. He wanted me to withdraw the fraud claims in the marriage case. He also wanted me to ask Blue Current to stop pursuing civil damages. I refused, but I did not post private photographs online. I did not give interviews to gossip channels. I did not release Camille's home address. When videos from the wedding spread across social media, I issued one short statement. My private relationship will be handled through family court. Corporate matters are being handled by independent auditors and the appropriate authorities. I will not comment further. I refuse to become a revenge bride in an entertainment story. This was not about a wealthy woman humiliating an ordinary husband. It was about a man who tried to turn marriage into a financial instrument and was exposed by his own records. My father came to Boston 1 week later. He did not ask why I had failed to see Julian clearly. He did not criticize me for hiding my identity. He only held me and said, "You don't have to keep proving that nothing can hurt you." That night I cried in front of my family for the first time. During my pregnancy, I started therapy. For years I had confused independence with never needing help, never admitting fear, never allowing anyone to support me. Always planning ahead, always controlling every risk, but real independence is not isolation. It is the ability to tell the truth, to accept help, and to leave when a relationship requires you to become smaller in order to survive it. 7 months later, I gave birth to a daughter. I named her June. She was tiny, with dark hair. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I felt a new kind of fear. I was afraid my anger toward Julian might affect the choices I made for her, so I made one decision immediately. I would never tell June that she had no father, and I would never use her to punish Julian. The court confirmed Julian's paternity. Because of the criminal case, his absence during most of the pregnancy, and his repeated attempts to reach me through third parties, I received primary custody. Julian was required to complete parenting classes and a psychological evaluation before supervised visitation could begin. The first visit happened when June was 10 months old. Julian sat in the family center, too nervous to hold her. A staff member showed him how to support her head. June wrapped her small hand around his finger. Julian looked down and cried. I watched through one-way glass. I had not forgiven him. But I did not hate him enough to want him to lose every chance to become a safe father. Boundaries are not revenge. Boundaries decide the conditions under which someone may approach you without harming you again. 18 months later, I began leading the redevelopment of Pier 47. The trust planned to convert part of the old shipyard into a public ferry maintenance center. The other section would become a vocational training school. The structural engineer on the project was Miles Carter. He was 39 and owned a small marine engineering firm. After our first meeting, he did not invite me to an expensive restaurant. He asked, "Would you walk the shipyard with me?" He wanted to understand why I insisted on preserving several old rail tracks that no longer served a practical purpose. I explained that dock workers once used them to move ship hulls through the yard. Removing them would be easy. Keeping them would allow future students to understand how the place had operated. Miles listened. Then he revised the plans. He did not complain about the cost. He did not tell me he knew more because he was the engineer. We worked together for 9 months. He never asked about my personal assets. He did not use the Whitmore name in interviews. Once, his team discovered that a contractor had installed steel that did not meet the approved specification. Stopping work would cost his firm a significant amount of money. I asked whether the trust should cover part of the immediate loss. He shook his head. My team should have caught it sooner. I need to handle the part that belongs to me first. I thought about Julian. Whenever Julian faced a problem, his first instinct was to find someone else to carry it. Miles's first instinct was to identify his own responsibility. We did not go on our first date until a year after the project was completed. I did not hide anything from him. Before dinner, I told him, "My life is complicated. I control a family trust. I have a daughter, and I have an ex-husband who may eventually be part of her life." Miles nodded. "Thank you for telling me." I waited for him to ask how much the trust was worth. Instead, he asked, "What kind of pancakes does June like?" I laughed. "Why are you asking that? If we keep seeing each other, I might eat breakfast with her one day. I don't want to make the wrong kind the first time." I did not fall in love because of one thoughtful question. I did not assume he would never hurt me. This time I did not test him. I did not sacrifice myself to prove loyalty. I watched. I watched whether his actions matched his words. I watched how he behaved when he was disappointed. I watched whether his face changed when I said no. The first time Miles met June, he did not bring an expensive gift. He brought a set of small boats that could be assembled in the bathtub. June splashed water everywhere. Miles's shirt was soaked. He did not become irritated. He did not perform for me or try too hard to look like a perfect father. He picked up a towel and said, "Next time we build a fleet, we may need a better flood control plan." June laughed until she could barely breathe. A year later, Miles asked me to marry him. Not at the grand opening of Pier 47, not in front of investors or reporters. June had a fever that night. Miles and I took turns holding her. At 3 in the morning, she finally fell asleep. Miles sat on the kitchen floor with a cup of cold coffee. He looked at me and said, "When today is over, would you be willing to talk about getting married?" I stared at him. "Are you proposing right now?" "No. You're exhausted, and June is sick. I don't want you making a major decision tonight. I only want you to know that I'm ready. When you're ready, we can talk." 3 days later, I brought it up again. I told him my answer was yes. Our wedding was small, only family and close friends attended. June carried a flower basket but sat down halfway through the aisle and refused to keep walking. Everyone laughed. Miles did not rush her. He walked over, picked her up, and carried her the rest of the way. In that moment, I did not think about the company Julian had lost. I did not think about Camille. I did not think about the ferry where my first wedding had ended. I only felt calm. People sometimes ask whether hiding my identity was wrong. Yes. I no longer deny that. You cannot build a secret environment and expect it to perfectly test another person's love. Real intimacy requires honesty. But my mistake did not make Julian's choices acceptable. A person failing to tell you she is wealthy does not give you permission to steal company money. It does not give you permission to mortgage her property. And it does not give you permission to stand at a wedding while planning to leave with someone else. More than one person can make a mistake. That does not mean every mistake is equal. I also asked myself whether Julian's early kindness had been fake. I do not believe it was. Maybe he really loved me. But loving someone once does not remove the consequences of deliberately hurting her later. The beginning of a relationship can be real. The ending can be real too. When June was 4 years old, we saw Julian at an open house for the Pier 47 training school. He had completed the supervision required after his sentence. He had also continued therapy and parenting classes. He did not walk directly toward us. He waited at the required distance until a family center worker came over. That afternoon, he and June built a small wooden boat. June asked, "Did you work here before?" Julian looked at me, then he answered, "Yes, but I made some very bad choices, so I could not stay." He did not say I had destroyed his career. He did not say I had tricked him by hiding my identity. He did not blame Camille. It was the first time I heard him take responsibility in simple words. Before he left, he said to me, "I used to believe loving someone gave me the right to enter her life whenever I wanted. Now I understand that love can also mean accepting that she no longer leaves the door open for you." I did not tell him I forgave him. I only nodded. Some apologies are not meant to begin a new relationship. They are only meant to stop the damage from continuing. My new life did not begin when Miles appeared. It did not begin when Julian faced legal consequences. It did not even begin when I revealed my identity at the wedding. It began that morning in the penthouse. Julian stood in my living room expecting me to believe another explanation. He expected me to feel sorry for him because I was pregnant. He expected me to hand him my shipyard, my company, and my future again. For the first time, I did not try to save him. I let him pick up his own suitcases, and I watched him walk out the door. Healthy love does not ask you to surrender your property, your accounts, your career, and your judgment to prove trust. It does not treat your kindness like a loan with no limit and no due date. Love is not one person constantly asking and the other constantly understanding. Love means both people tell the truth. Both people carry their own responsibility. And before making a decision that changes everything, both people are willing to stop and ask, "Will this hurt you?" I once believed the happiest ending was finding someone who would never make a mistake. Now I know that person does not exist. A more realistic kind of happiness is finding someone who does not hide when he makes one, someone who does not blame you, someone who does not use your love to make you pay for his choices. He tells you what happened. He admits what he did, and then he leaves the decision with you. Julian believed marriage would give him a shipyard. In the end, what he lost was not the shipyard. It was not even the company. He lost a woman who had once trusted him completely. And what I gained was not only my property, my career, or a healthier marriage. I gained something more important. I stopped betraying my own instincts just to prove I was worthy of love. That was my real happy ending.